In the early afternoon of a mid-April day in 209 BC, a steady wind drifted in from across the Mediterranean, stirring a thick trail of dust rising into the air along the eastern coastline of Hispania. The dust, kicked up by thousands of Roman feet, pounding a relentless rhythm on the earth. 25,000 infantry driving south at a blistering pace, 45 kilometers a day, an unheard of speed, each step plunging them deeper into hostile territory. At their head rode a single figure, their 27-year-old commander, Publius Cornelius Scipio, his red cloak snapping in the wind as his eyes scanned the horizon. They were close to the heart of Punic power in Spain. For more than a week, his soldiers had marched without knowing their target. Only 2 men carrying the secret from the start, Scipio and his trusted second-in-command, Gaius Laelius, admiral of the 35 warships, just off the coast, shadowing the infantry from the sea. Back in Tarraco, for months, the two had bent over maps and scraps of intelligence, from scouts, informants, spies, and enemy prisoners, revealing the garrison's numbers, weak points in the wall, the patterns of the tides that surrounded the city. Every fact tested, every detail weighed and set into place, from which an audacious plan had taken shape. Then, with just 2 days left to go, Scipio had finally revealed the truth to the rest of his men, as they pushed on, driven by the knowledge of what they were about to attempt. Even now, into the 10th day, their legs burned with fatigue, yet not a single soldier fell behind. Off their left flank, Laelius and the fleet rode in perfect rhythm, always within sight. And ahead, 2,500 Roman cavalry fanned out across the west and south, hunting for any Punic riders who might try to slip away. The road dipped, then, cresting the last ridge, Scipio saw the coast spread out in a sweep of blue, a great natural bay, the air heavy with salt, gulls crying overhead, and at its center, the city, Carthago Nova. High stone walls, towers crowned with Punic standards, the harbor crowded with trade ships and war galleys. To the north, a vast lagoon shimmered under the sun. The city sat almost like an island linked to the mainland by a narrow isthmus, the only land approach to the city. And inside the city, the Carthaginian garrison had just come to realize the grave danger they were in. The only announcement of the Roman arrival was the dust drifting in the air. But by now, Scipio knew it was far too late for the enemy to send out pleas for help. Surprise achieved in full. The fleet moved into position, sealing off the harbor, while the cavalry closed the ring on land, surrounding Carthago Nova completely. And yet, there was no time to waste. Despite all the measures he had taken, the surprise could only hold for so long. And even if a fraction of the 90,000 Carthaginian soldiers strewn across Hispania arrived in time, the opportunity would vanish. Scipio kicked his heels into the flanks of his horse, signaling the army toward the isthmus. The attack would need to be swift, vicious, and complete. He had rehearsed it in his mind hundreds of times, but now it was time to strike. Welcome to the Warlords of History podcast. I'm your host, Mark Pimenta. And for this episode, part 11 of our series on Scipio Africanus, we'll deep dive into Scipio's incredible assault of Carthago Nova in 209 BC, a lightning strike that immediately began shifting the balance of power in Hispania and reshaping the entire course of the Second Punic War. Being that, for the Punic Empire, Carthago Nova was more than just a city. It was the jewel of their Spanish dominion, anchoring their power in Iberia as a major naval base and supply hub, and the critical artery through which silver streamed into Carthage's coffers. contributing factors that, despite the overwhelming advantage in Carthaginian military might in the theater, outnumbering the Romans almost 3-1, led the new Roman general in Spain, Scipio, to narrow his sights on this city as the target of a high-speed, high-risk operation in early April 209 BC, leading his army in a furious 10-day march down the length of the eastern coast of Hispania, while the Roman fleet mirrored their march offshore, catching the Carthaginians completely off guard with their sudden arrival. Followed by a fierce assault, and the final, decisive stroke coming when Scipio revealed a hidden path through waters thought impassable, enabling his soldiers to breach the city's defenses, and that, according to Scipio, had been gifted to him by the Roman sea god Neptune, but in truth was no divine miracle, rather just one piece of what had been a carefully calculated and orchestrated plan, informed through impressive intelligence gathering and executed through rigorous preparation, and that, unbelievably, resulted in the capture of Carthago Nova in a single day. A stunning achievement, nothing less than a masterpiece of leadership, intelligence, timing, and execution, one that sent shockwaves throughout the region, drawing Iberian allies to Rome and crippling Carthage's strength in Hispania. A spark of brilliance, Scipio's first as a commander, but far from his last. However, before we delve deeper into the episode, I want to take a brief moment to recognize the warlords of history immortals, the incredible patrons of the show. I am truly grateful for your ongoing support. And for anyone interested in joining them, you can find the show's Patreon and PayPal links in the support section of the Warlords of History website. Otherwise, if that isn't an option for you, there's another powerful way you can support the show, by leaving a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening from. Your feedback makes the show more visible and helps bring new listeners in. Even a short comment about what you enjoyed or found fascinating in the episode goes a long way. All right, now, as per usual, let's quickly revisit where we left off in the last episode. In the late summer of 210 BC, with the 26-year-old Scipio arriving in Hispania, seizing command of this critical theater, not by senatorial appointment, but through the overwhelming support of the Roman masses. Once again, breaking res publica tradition and unsettling many senators who saw him as a reckless upstart, brave and talented, but woefully untested as a general. Moreover, inheriting a disastrous situation, being that Rome's armies had been shattered at the Battle of the Upper Baetis in the prior year, when both his father and uncle were killed, resulting in Rome's local Iberian support drying up, and the Republic left clinging to a fragile foothold in northeastern Spain. Yet, from the moment Scipio took command, the tone shifted. He rebuilt morale by invoking divine favor for their mission and forging close bonds with his men, before instituting an intense training regimen over the winter of 210 into 209 BC, as his army emerged impressively sharper, stronger, while also aggressively reasserting Rome's authority over its frontiers. This, at the same time Scipio had quietly pieced together an elaborate intelligence network, exposing a rare opportunity: Carthage's 3 large armies scattered across the Iberian Peninsula, leaving their prized stronghold, Carthago Nova, thinly defended by just 3,000 men. Spurring Scipio in early April 209 BC to gather 27,500 men at the mouth of the Ebro, joined by Laelius and the fleet of 35 warships, where ahead of them lay open a narrow window, 10 days to reach Carthago Nova and strike, before the Carthaginians could react. Bringing us back to where we left things off in the last episode, before leading his army south, Scipio leaving one of his top officers, Marcus Junius Silanus, with just 3,500 men to hold Rome's domains in northeastern Hispania. a skeleton force by any measure. And had the Carthaginians been aware of this, while they might have pressed the frontier, by the spring of 209, they had lost their eyes and ears inside Roman territory and along its edges, with Scipio's army having delivered punishing blows through the winter, making the Punic commanders cautious of sending in more scouting and raiding units. Undoubtedly a concern, but one to be dealt with later, since they were already busy as it was suppressing tribal rebellions. Besides, the Romans seemed too few and too far away to threaten anything of real value, emphasized by Philip Freeman in his book, Hannibal, Rome's Greatest Enemy, when he writes, "The last thing they expected was for Scipio to march his outnumbered army hundreds of miles south of the Ebro and attack their city of New Carthage," which resulted in, as detailed by Basil Hart in his book, Scipio Africanus, Greater Than Napoleon, of the 3 large Carthaginian armies present in Iberia, none of them within less than 10 days' march from New Carthage. A key piece of intelligence that, once confirmed by Scipio's network in the early spring of 209 BC, gave him his chance. Quietly amassing 25,000 infantry and 2,500 cavalry at the mouth of the Ebro, while Laelius readied the 35 warships to shadow the army down the coast. Among those accompanying Scipio was his younger brother Lucius, only 19, almost certainly present, though with no major command, there to learn, watching his brother lead. And what he would have surely witnessed before the march began was the way Scipio further galvanized his troops, ensuring omens were taken and, as always, declared favorable, before proclaiming that they together had been chosen by the gods to end Carthage's dominion in Hispania. Yet beneath those words, we can imagine deeper personal motives burned: vengeance for his father and uncle, defiance of the Senate that doubted him, and perhaps, above all, in the never-ending pursuit of dignitas, the honor that would immortalize not just the Cornelii Scipione name, but his as well. Then his orders rang out, standards lifted, trumpets blared, and the column surged south, cavalry riding out ahead, as the oars from the fleet flashed in rhythm with the march. The beginning of a 10-day, 450-kilometer dash, advancing headlong into Punic-held territory. However, beyond the personal and patriotic motives driving Scipio forward, there were also crucial strategic reasons that led him to fix his sights squarely on Carthago Nova, otherwise known as New Carthage or today Cartagena, Spain. Because, as we touched on in the last episode, Carthage's hold over Iberia was predominantly administered through 2 cities, Gades, modern Cadiz in the far south, and Carthago Nova on the southeastern coast. But of the 2, New Carthage had become by far the more important, where silver from the nearby mines was minted into coin to fill Carthage's treasury, as well as being a vast supply and naval base with shorter routes to North Africa. Its loss would severely hamper Carthage's ability to fund and supply its armies, while sending a powerful message to the Iberian tribes that Rome's new commander wasn't simply defending the northeast, but boldly taking the fight to the enemy. Yet Scipio's vision went even further. He understood that if Rome was to ever conquer Hispania outright, as Howard Scullard writes in his book, Scipio Africanus, Soldier and Politician, unless he was to secure a base in the south, Scipio could never hope to subdue the interior, nor solidify a firm hold on the rest of southern Spain. So realizing the need, what better base could Scipio look for than the enemy's? Another prime example of Scipio's strategizing and foresight, thinking not only of the immediate blow, but of the long campaign to come. Carthago Nova was the key, a prize that would give Rome a permanent base and the reach to press the war in Hispania for as long as it took, which belies a fascinating contrast in that, despite all his words and gestures, repeatedly emphasizing divine favor behind their cause, Scipio was not at all relying on the gods to carry his army to victory. Instead, what guided their path was nothing less than rigorous planning. For months, together with Laelius, refining every detail, knowing that only speed and secrecy could deliver New Carthage before its garrison realized what was coming, or before any of the 3 Carthaginian armies could respond. Keeping his intentions so closely guarded that, even as the march kicked off, none but Laelius knew the target, Scipio fearing leaks, spies, or even careless talk that might betray his plans. As such, in the first days of April 209 BC, began one of the most remarkable forced marches of the ancient world. 10 relentless days southward, infantry, cavalry, and fleet moving in perfect concert. This is Hannibal-level stuff we're talking about here. Which might be raising the question for you. Did Scipio know it would take 10 days? The answer appears to be a strong yes. His intelligence network, terrain assessments, and careful calculations of distance and pace all pointed to that figure. The ancient historian Polybius, in his work The Histories, too, makes all of this clear when writing. Although many make the mistake of attributing Scipio's accomplishments and successes not to the man and his foresight, but rather to the gods and to chance, they neglect the fact that Scipio undertook all his operations in Spain, and particularly the assault of Carthago Nova, only after making extensive calculations. Polybius even goes on to reference a letter penned by Scipio to another, specifically detailing how he calculated the speed and distance his army would need to travel. With, I think, the main takeaway here is that whatever divine aura Scipio allowed himself to be wrapped in, beneath it lay a commander that put a massive emphasis on preparation, like a methodical card counter, aiming to see and cover all the angles, leaving nothing to chance. And now, as the march began, we'll explore the product of those detailed preparations set into motion. And although whichever way you look at it, the pace of the march was truly astounding, one point of contention is with both Polybius and Livy claiming that Scipio and his men covered the 450-kilometer distance from the Ebro River to Carthago Nova in just 7 days, a figure that works out to 64 kilometers per day. And while perhaps possible under the most optimal of conditions, I tend to side with modern takes favoring a more reasonable estimate of 10 days. But make no mistake, even then, that means they were covering about 45 kilometers per day. Still extraordinary, and right at the upper extreme of what we know to have been possible. To help put this into perspective, a standard Roman march was 15 to 20 kilometers. A forced march, maybe 30. But here we have Scipio's men covering the equivalent of just over a marathon's distance every single day. A feat only possible due to the months of intense training and conditioning Scipio had put his forces through. But also made possible because Laelius, admiral of the fleet of 35 quinqueremes, was following the plan to a T, careful to never outpace Scipio's column. As Livy notes in his work From the Founding of the City, regulating the speed of his ships so as to maintain sight of Scipio and his army on the landward side at all times, rendering the army and navy bound together, advancing in perfect symphony, step for step, oar for oar, in a single coordinated thrust deep into enemy territory. But what exactly was going on here? Why had Scipio and Laelius arranged for the fleet to shadow the army the entire length of the march? The answer lies in the fact that the ships weren't simply playing a supporting role. They were integral to the whole endeavor. In effect, Laelius's fleet acting as a pack mule, shield, sword, and lifeboat all at once. As a pack mule, the ships carrying the bulk of the army's supplies and equipment, freeing the infantry from their heaviest burdens and allowing them to maintain that blistering pace. As a shield, with the fleet patrolling the coastline, ensuring no enemy ships stumbled across the column and raced off to warn New Carthage. As a sword, being that the fleet too would be involved in the eventual assault of the city, striking at the harbor and seaward walls, especially through the marines on board each ship, a special unit class called Milite Classiarii, meaning soldiers of the fleet, more akin to light infantry troops, but trained for amphibious attacks. A quinquereme typically carrying around 30 to 40 such marines, across 35 ships, amounting to an estimated 1,200 more men that Scipio could hurl against Carthago Nova. And finally, we have the fleet as a lifeboat. Polybius stressing this point as well, writing, "In the event of a failure, Scipio could, since he was the master of the sea, place his troops in a position of safety," going on to add that there was nothing in all this that was not due to the most close calculation. In other words, Scipio had even planned an exit strategy. If, for example, his intelligence proved faulty, or a Carthaginian army appeared sooner than expected, he could evacuate his heavy infantry by sea. Victory or failure, he had thought through every potential outcome. Now, the reality was, at sea, Scipio had little to fear. As we discussed back in Part 9, Rome ruled the waters of the western Mediterranean, Punic vessels often fleeing at the mere sight of Roman warships. The Iberian coast was no different. But on land, that was another matter entirely. Here, Carthage held the advantage. With nearly 90,000 troops in Iberia, their armies dwarfed Scipio's, even if spread across the peninsula. And had they discovered his southward thrust, even with the naval evacuation contingency in place, they still could have foiled Scipio's assault before it began. This is where the Roman general's 2,500 cavalry proved indispensable. Not only did they scout the roads and guide the infantry, they also kept the march invisible to unfriendly eyes. Patrick Hunt, in his book Hannibal, captures their role perfectly. Although his army marched very fast, his cavalry, ranging far and wide, were always out hunting in advance of the main force, eliminating any hostile observers who could have sent messengers to Carthago Nova, and possibly even to Carthaginian armies. Day after day, Roman squadrons fanned out far ahead and along the flanks of the infantry, clearing the path, chasing off, capturing, or cutting down any Carthaginian scouts before they could slip away. Thanks to them, not a whisper of Scipio's advance reached New Carthage until it was too late. And just as secrecy was kept from the Carthaginians, Scipio, as mentioned earlier, kept it from his own men as well. Only when the army was within 2 days of the city did he finally reveal their true objective. One can almost feel the jolt that must have run through the ranks. Exhaustion, suddenly eclipsed by a surge of adrenaline. Their destination no longer a mystery. Now, every step was charged with purpose. A surge of purpose that carried them straight to the target. Their 10 days of relentless marching ending as a resounding success. In mid-April 209 BC, with Scipio and his army suddenly appearing before the walls of Carthago Nova. All of his meticulous planning, secrecy, and coordination had paid off. And, astoundingly, as Philip Freeman emphasizes, Scipio and his army were at the walls of the city before anyone knew they had left Tarraco. The shock would have been total. The Punic garrison commander, a man by the name of Mago, not to be confused with Hannibal's brother of the same name. Wow, the Carthaginians really did love reusing Hannibal and Mago, didn't they? Well, this Mago only came to realize what was happening when Scipio's column appeared across the narrow isthmus leading to the city. And while he might have known something was coming their way earlier, given the plumes of dust rising into the air produced by the approaching 25,000 infantry, by then it was too late. Any messengers he sent off were promptly captured or killed by the Roman cavalry already encircling the city, while Laelius's fleet sealed off the bay, leaving Carthago Nova completely isolated. Operational surprise had been Scipio's greatest weapon, and he had achieved it flawlessly. Yet now, with the clock ticking anew, facing an entirely new race against time, being that Scipio knew full well that the 3 Carthaginian field armies would nonetheless soon learn what was happening, gauging that he had 1 week or 2 at most before any enemy forces could arrive, meaning that the city had to be taken quickly or the whole operation could collapse. And while Scipio caught another stroke of fortune in that Mago had been unable to further reinforce his garrison beyond 3,000 defenders, even with all the forces he had brought to bear, the Roman general understood that victory was far from guaranteed. Because a garrison of 3,000, well provisioned and behind stout walls, could hold off a vastly larger enemy for weeks or months, and Scipio had no time for a prolonged siege. But mounting a direct assault on a fortified city was one of the riskiest and could be one of the most costliest undertakings in ancient warfare. As the Chinese general and strategist Sun Tzu had warned centuries earlier in his famous military manual, The Art of War, the worst policy is to attack walled cities, and should be avoided. The general, unable to control his irritation, will launch his men to the assault like swarming ants, with the result that 1/3 of his men are slain, while the town still remains untaken. I would heavily wager Scipio never heard of Sun Tzu. However, he most certainly would have understood the fundamental point, that a fortified city could make 3,000 equal to 30,000. Meaning, numbers alone wouldn't win Carthago Nova. To succeed, he would need brilliance or luck. And as we've already seen, Scipio was not the type of person to leave anything to chance. Understanding, however, that the challenge before him was formidable indeed. Though Mago commanded only 3,000 men, those defenders were shielded by some of the strongest fortifications in Spain. Towering stone walls, anchored within a natural landscape that made the city itself a fortress. New Carthage had been laid out with extraordinary advantages. To the south stretched a broad bay opening to the sea, and to the west, a narrow canal that fed into a large lagoon to the north. As Howard Scullard describes, the town was thus surrounded by water on 3 sides, by the lagoon in the north, by the canal in the west, and by the bay leading to the open sea in the south. And while today the terrain around Cartagena has changed, the lagoon to the north long since vanished. In Scipio's era, the city stood almost like an island, accessible by only one real land approach, a narrow isthmus, barely 300 meters wide, that extended from the mainland to the city's main eastern gate. Polybius does mention a western city gate as well, accessible by a small wooden bridge over the canal, but it was so constricted that no serious assault could be made there. In effect, its geography served as a moat, only accessible by that narrow land bridge, funneling any would-be attackers by land to its eastern gate, a singular choke point. To help visualize this, I'll include a drawing of Carthago Nova's layout on the Images and Maps section of the Warlords of History website, with Scipio's assault points marked out. And where, on the afternoon of the 10th day, as soon as his men reached the isthmus, Scipio ordered a camp built at its far edge, where it connects to the mainland, sealing off the only land approach, driving Mago to post 2,000 men to guard the eastern gate and walls opposite the Roman camp, while the remaining 1,000 defenders manned the southern walls facing the harbor, where Laelius's fleet had anchored. However, as soon as Scipio's men set about constructing their camp, there was something very curious about the Roman setup. 2 features in particular stand out. First, What the Carthaginian garrison would have noticed from the walls was the odd layout. Strangely, the Roman infantry were only raising fortifications on the outer side of the camp, facing away from the city. Polybius describes this clearly, Scipio ordering his troops to construct fortifications defending only the outer side of the camp, by a palisade and double trench reaching from sea to sea, but erecting barely any defenses on the side facing the town. Livy echoes this, stressing how little effort it would have taken to fortify the city-facing side, yet Scipio left it open. Now, on a practical level, this made sense. If a Carthaginian relief force suddenly appeared, the Romans would need a strong line to fall back on. But from the walls of Carthago Nova, it must have looked like something else entirely, almost as if Scipio were inviting the garrison to charge out and meet him in the open. Which raises the obvious question, why would Mago ever consider it? After all, he had only 3,000 men against Scipio's 27,500. Leading us to the second unusual feature of the Roman setup, hints that Scipio deliberately made his army appear smaller than it really was. Some modern historians, including Howard Scullard, suggest he may have concealed part of his force by transferring 1,000 to 2,000 men onto Laelius's ships to strike later from the harbor, while others lingered out of sight during the day, slipping into the Roman camp under the cover of night. And while no ancient sources confirm this directly, I tend to agree with Scullard when he argues that these tactics, the open camp, the illusion of fewer numbers, were designed to provoke the Carthaginians to a sortie, which, if successful, would mean a fight on favorable ground beyond the protection of the city walls, causing considerable loss to the already numerically small garrison. The Roman commander, thereby, layering in psychological elements, weaving deception into the very fabric of his assault plan, much like Hannibal himself, daring his opponent to make the wrong move. Then, into the early hours of the next morning, before first light, within the Roman camp, concealed from enemy eyes, the Roman general convened council with Laelius and his senior officers to finalize the details. The plan was clear, a two-pronged assault. Scipio would lead the main army across the isthmus against the eastern gate, while Laelius would bring his fleet in close against the southern harbor walls. His marines, reinforced by the infantry, secretly shifted onto the ships the day before. And with preparations set, Scipio then gathered his troops, according to Basil Hart, telling them, "You will in actuality attack the walls of a single city, but in that single city you will have made yourselves masters of all Spain." The message was clear. This was no ordinary raid. The capture of Carthago Nova would be the catalyst to breaking Carthage's power in Iberia. He emphasized the vast wealth behind the city's walls, promising rich rewards to those that distinguished themselves in battle, but then reached deeper still, including religion to spur motivation, assuring his soldiers that not only were the gods behind them, but that the Roman sea god, Neptune himself, would intervene when the time was right. As recorded by Polybius when he writes, "Finally, Scipio told them that it was Neptune who had first suggested this plan to him, appearing to him in his sleep, and promising that when the time for action came, he would render such conspicuous aid that his intervention would be manifest to the whole army." Whether they truly believed or not, altogether, the effect of their commander's words was reportedly electric. Plunder, glory, and divine favor all fused together as the soldiers burned with conviction. Exhaustion from the previous 10-day exertion gave way to fierce anticipation, with the assault now at hand. Meanwhile, from the city walls, Mago and his men watched with growing unease. The previous day, they had wondered whether the Romans meant to blockade them into submission. But with the dawn and the first rays of daylight breaking through, unveiled were the unmistakable signs. Their city, was about to be stormed. Then the Roman trumpets blared, echoing across the bay and the isthmus, signaling the assault to begin. As planned, approaching in two great thrusts, Laelius bringing his fleet to the southern harbor walls, deploying roughly 3,000 men, marines and detachments of Scipio's infantry, with scaling ladders trying to mount the defenses from the sea, while Scipio advanced on the eastern gate, personally leading a small detachment of less than 1,000 troops. But already, Scipio's cunning bore fruit, because this is when the Carthaginian garrison commander fell squarely into his trap. According to Polybius, as soon as Scipio had given the signal for the assault by bugle, Mago sent 2,000 of his troops out through the gate, feeling sure of striking terror into the enemy and entirely defeating their design. Eager to disrupt the attack before it even began, Mago hurled nearly 2/3 of his garrison against what he thought was an inferior and vulnerable Roman force, aiming to break their morale at the outset and seize the initiative. The Carthaginians surged across the isthmus, slamming into Scipio's vanguard, step by step, causing the Romans to give ground, falling back toward their camp, until, at Scipio's command, the line halted, shields locked, the legionnaires dug in, straining to hold under the weight of the assault, which is when the Roman general sprung his trap. Livy paints a vivid picture. From behind, within the nearby camp, hidden detachments burst forth in waves, 2,000 to 3,000 fresh infantry flooding into the fight. In an instant, the Carthaginians were engulfed, their bold sally quickly turning into a disaster, and so pressed to retreat in disorder that they stampeded over each other at the gate. The fighting was savage. Perhaps 500 to 600 Carthaginian soldiers were cut down in the rout. Nearly 1/5 of the entire garrison destroyed in just the opening clash. Mago had paid dearly for taking the bait, resulting in the Romans very nearly forcing their way into the city, but the defenders rallying just in time, slamming the gates shut, with Scipio continuing to press the attack, leading from the front and ordering fresh waves with scaling ladders against the walls. Polybius noting that he was protected by 3 men carrying large shields, allowing him to remain at the front, inspiring his soldiers with his presence. Yet, the city's defenses were formidable, its great walls and battlements bolstering the Punic defenders as they hurled beams, rocks, and missiles down from the battlements upon the Romans. Can you imagine what it must have been like for one of these Roman soldiers, standing beneath those walls, waiting your turn, as missiles rained down, ladders splintered and shattered, climbers hurled back, men crashing to the earth beside you? Horrific hardly even begins to describe it. Still, Polybius writes, Roman courage was relentless. In spite of all these difficulties, nothing could restrain the dash and fury of the Romans. But while the first scalers were still falling, the vacant places were instantly taken by the next in order. But bravery wasn't enough. After hours of bitter struggle, both the eastern assault and Laelius's attempt from the sea had been repulsed. Roman casualties mounted and exhaustion set in. Finally, Scipio sounded the recall by bugle, ordering an end to the attack. From the walls, the Carthaginian defenders roared in triumph. Despite their initial setback, they had repelled the Romans' furious assault. To them, it seemed the day was theirs, the city saved, while maybe even having forced the Romans into the one thing they couldn't afford, a long, drawn-out siege. After all, it was rare, almost unheard of, for an attacking army to attempt a second storming on the very same day. Normally, as Polybius suggests, exhausted troops would be given at least a day or two to recover their strength before another attempt. However, Scipio was no ordinary commander, but one who calculated and planned for this conquest with precision. Even as the defenders exulted in their apparent victory, Scipio was already preparing to strike again, but also because he had been waiting for something very specific, paying particular attention to the lagoon north of the city, for reasons that will be made clear shortly. Then, in the early afternoon of the same day, to the Carthaginians' astonishment, the Roman trumpet sounded once again, a second assault underway. Once more, Laelius pressed his ships in against the southern walls, landing marines and infantry. Once more, Scipio himself led the main thrust against the eastern gate. However, in addition to sending forth men with scaling ladders, at the same time, advancing another large block of soldiers to the gate, using the testudo formation, translated as the tortoise formation, which, let's go to Patrick Hunt, who provides more context on what this was, involving a body of soldiers tightly packed together and overlapping their shields to create a nearly impenetrable wall around them, over top and to the sides of the body of men, which in this instance provided protection for the soldiers inside this defensive shell to hack at the eastern gate with axes. Again and again, the defenders hurled projectiles from above, but Scipio kept the pressure relentless. Given what Theodore Dodge explains in his book Hannibal was one of Scipio's primary aims, to tire out the Punic defenders without exhausting his men, doing so by sending in constant relays of fresh troops. However, with the Punic garrison, to their credit, putting up a stubborn resistance, and as hours dragged on, with the walls and gates still holding, it seemed the second assault would falter like the first. But then, Scipio intensified the attack, stretching the defenders thinner, ordering a diversionary strike at the city's small western gate, across the narrow channel that linked the bay to the northern lagoon. Only a few hundred soldiers were sent, but enough to force the defenders to yet another point of attack. The pressure was mounting. Carthage's garrison was wary, outnumbered, and now forced to defend on 3 fronts. And while their eyes remained fixed on the eastern gate, the harbor, and the western canal, above all, this drew their attention away from where Scipio, interestingly, months prior, had long planned to strike the fatal blow upon the city's northern walls protected by the lagoon. Because hours into the second assault, this is when the god Neptune finally revealed his vision to Scipio. Well, at least that's what he said to his men, in particular to the 500 hand-picked soldiers that he had kept out of the fight, needing to keep them fresh. Livy captures the moment well. What Scipio had ascertained by calculation, he represented as a miracle and an act of the gods to his men, for whom a passage was given. Scipio bade them to follow Neptune as their guide on the march, and to make their way straight across the lagoon to the walls. Behind this divine tale lay cold calculation. Months earlier, in Tarraco, Scipio's intelligence gathering had uncovered a weakness in Carthago Nova's natural defenses, through local fishermen learning of the lagoon's daily ebb, when the tide receded enough to make parts of it fordable. Scipio had timed the second assault precisely for this moment, when the waters were beginning to drop. And as the Carthaginian defenders strained to hold the Romans at the eastern gate, the harbor walls, and the western canal, Scipio gave the signal. 500 men carrying scaling ladders overhead waded silently through the lagoon toward the northern walls, finding the battlements unguarded. Within moments, they scaled the walls, forcing their way into the city, just as Laelius's marines broke through from the harbor to the south. The fate of Carthago Nova was sealed. However, it was the force from the lagoon that more so proved decisive. Because once inside, they swept down upon the defenders at the eastern gate. Livy tells us they suddenly attacked the defenders protecting the east gate from behind, fiercely cutting into them, quickly gaining control of the gate and forcing it open. And with the gate thrown wide, chaos erupted. Roman troops pouring in, not in neat battlefield formations, but in savage, close-quarters combat just inside the main gate. That quickly spread to the nearby avenues, as the fight turned into vicious personal struggles in the narrow streets and alleys, defenders scattering and cut down in brutal pursuit, followed by Scipio himself, leading a large group of around 4,000 men in disciplined formation, driving straight for the city citadel. Basil Hart notes, taking care to keep them in regular formation, directing them toward the last Carthaginian stronghold in the city. All across Carthago Nova, the situation deteriorated for Mago's men, with Roman troops flooding in from every direction. By now, the original garrison, half gone, reduced to about 1,500 defenders, was hopelessly outnumbered, and more importantly, with no barriers protecting them against their marauding enemy. Outflanked, scattered, and exhausted, the Carthaginian defense rapidly crumbled. Now, interestingly, among the many differences between Scipio and the bulk of Roman generals of his day, one that stands out is how Scipio is often praised for his mild treatment of conquered foes, especially towards the non-combatant populace. And while there is indeed a lot of truth to this, the thing is, Carthago Nova hadn't yet surrendered. As such, when his troops surged into the city, Scipio did not stay their hands. Rather, as Philip Freeman bluntly comments, Scipio, in true Roman fashion, ordered his men to slaughter any man, woman, or child they found. You see, Roman legions were infamous for such merciless brutality. When a city was stormed rather than surrendered, indiscriminate bloodshed wasn't just permitted, it was expected. Scipio, for all his differences, was no exception here. His men scoured the streets, hunting down Carthaginian soldiers, cutting through pockets of resistance while leaving no figure standing, soldier and civilian alike. Yet even here, discipline mattered. The Roman commander forbade plundering until the city was his. First came terror. Plundering would come later, but in an organized and controlled fashion. Polybius gives us a chilling picture of the carnage that unfolded. When Scipio thought that a sufficient number of troops had entered, he sent most of them, as is the Roman custom, against the inhabitants of the city, with orders to kill all they encountered, sparing none. They do this to inspire terror, so that when towns are taken by the Romans, one may often see not only the corpses of human beings, but dogs cut in half, and the dismembered limbs of other animals. And on this occasion, such scenes were many. It was a horror meant to break the spirit of any ongoing resistance. And while the streets ran red, Scipio led his organized force against the citadel, to where Mago and the remnants of the defenders had fled. By this time, however, fewer than 1,000 Carthaginian soldiers remained under arms. Scipio advanced with overwhelming strength, 4,000 men, and more pressing in from all sides. The Carthaginians fought with the desperation of the doomed, but it was hopeless. Bloodshed echoed through the narrow streets, Roman war cries mixing with the shrieks of civilians. Surrounded, outnumbered, realizing the city was hopelessly lost, Mago finally surrendered the citadel to Scipio. As soon as Mago surrendered the citadel, Scipio gave the signal, and in an instant, the killing stopped. As Basil Hart observes, the very fact that the massacre ceased the moment Scipio gave the order is irrefutable proof of the discipline he commanded over his troops. The same soldiers who had moments earlier been tearing through the city now halted, sheathing their swords at once. Carthago Nova was his. In one astonishing day, Scipio had seized the glittering jewel of Carthage's Spanish dominion. The achievement was staggering. Considered as a whole, the relentless march south, the elaborate preparations, the clever ploys, and the execution of the assault itself. I think Barry Strauss, in his book Masters of Command, captures it exceptionally well when he writes, "It was as bold a move as Hannibal's march on Italy, and as cunning in its execution as his tactics at Cannae." The results were just as remarkable when measured in casualties. Of the 3,000 Carthaginian defenders, some 2,500 were slain and 500 taken prisoner. By contrast, whereas to storm a city was usually to bleed for it, attackers often losing thousands before they ever breached the walls, Roman casualties were surprisingly light, with fewer than 500 lost. Philip Freeman also speaks to the scale of the disaster for the Punic Empire, writing, "Against all odds, the leading Carthaginian city of Spain had quickly fallen to an untried Roman general in his 20s. It was a disaster beyond measure for Carthage, and one that would alter the course of the war for Hannibal. Because with this single decisive victory, Scipio had transformed the balance of power in Hispania. The capture of Carthago Nova carrying consequences both immediate and long-term. We'll turn to the broader implications in due course, but first, the immediate gains. With Rome having just secured a powerful base deep in enemy territory, and with it, a vast hoard of wealth, supplies, weapons, and even warships. All of which was accumulated upon Mago's surrender of the citadel to Scipio, who quickly moved to impose order throughout the city, having the surviving inhabitants, Polybius records, nearly 10,000 in all, rounded up into an open area within the city and placed under guard, allowing the rest of his troops to conduct a systematic plundering of the city without further harm to the populace. Valuables were seized and piled into the central marketplace until it overflowed with treasure. Staggering sums of silver from the city's treasury, heaps of gold and jewelry, even personal belongings stripped from the households, the accumulated wealth of Carthage's greatest city in Spain. Polybius notes the scale of the windfall. From all the public funds of the Carthaginians which had been captured, there were more than 600 talents. These were added to the 400 he had brought from Rome, leaving the total sum at his disposal at more than 1,000 talents. To help put this into perspective, the 600 talents of silver gained was enough to fund a full consular army, 2 Roman legions plus 2 allied legions, for almost an entire year. And this was after Scipio had already distributed a portion of the plunder to his men, along with lavish rewards to those who had distinguished themselves in the attack, including his admiral Gaius Laelius. But the riches didn't end with silver. The Romans seized enormous stores of grain, arms, armor, and military equipment, along with 63 merchant and transport ships, and, as mentioned by Patrick Hunt, 18 Carthaginian warships, which were promptly added to Laelius's fleet, expanding it to 53 warships, a sudden and dramatic strengthening of Roman naval dominance in Iberian waters. Resources and riches that enabled Scipio's campaign, from this point onward, to become largely self-sustaining in a foreign theater no less, an impressive achievement in its own right. Yet, beyond the wealth and supplies, one question was now looming over the city, a question that made the defeated populace tremble in fear. What would their Roman conqueror do with them? Because, ordinarily, the fate of a city taken by storm under Rome was grim. Men, women, and children alike could expect humiliation, brutality, and more often than not, a lifetime of slavery in foreign lands. Yet here, Scipio chose a different path, displaying the restraint for which he would later become famous, a surprising leniency almost unheard of among Roman generals. That's not to say all were spared. Roughly 20 high-ranking Carthaginians, members of the Council of Elders, prominent aristocrats, and the garrison commander Mago, were placed in chains to be later sent to the Senate as living proof of his victory. But for the nearly 10,000 other inhabitants, the outcome was much, much better than what they would have been expecting. Anthony Everett, in his book The Rise of Rome, highlights the contrast. Scipio showed his lack of conventional Roman brutality by not doing to Carthago Nova what had been meted out to the citizens of Capua and Syracuse. Not only did the massacre of civilians stop as soon as the garrison surrendered, but after the plundering, the bulk of its citizens were then released and allowed to return to their homes. Women, children, and older men permitted to return to their dwellings, stripped of valuables, yes, but with their lives and freedom intact, with Scipio even ensuring food was distributed. Most striking of all, he enforced strict discipline among his troops, forbidding assault on women or further looting. As for the younger, able-bodied men, Scipio made distinctions. Citizens who were skilled artisans and craftsmen were enrolled as public slaves of the Roman Republic. But unlike the grim fate of being sold into private bondage, their servitude was temporary, to end once Carthage finally surrendered. Meanwhile, the city's young male non-citizens and slaves were pressed into naval service, Scipio handing them over to Laelius to row the 18 captured Carthaginian warships. But even here, they were promised their freedom once the war concluded. Still relatively harsh, but measured, compared to the annihilation that so often followed Roman conquest, these were unexpected acts of mercy. But more than that, they were strategic, winning him admiration among the native Iberians, having sharply turned their heads, watching Rome's commander with keen interest. Interest and admiration amplified by what would happen next. Considering that, of everything Scipio gained from the fall of Carthago Nova, certainly among the most valuable were the 300 Iberian hostages. Sons, daughters, and wives of Iberian nobles, held by the Carthaginians to guarantee tribal loyalty. In a single day, Scipio had gained leverage over almost every major tribe in central and eastern Iberia. But unlike the Carthaginians, Scipio didn't treat these hostages simply as pawns. He took the time to meet with them, asking about their families, their tribes, and their leaders, always in search of knowledge he might turn to Rome's advantage, while positioning himself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator of Hispania, perhaps borrowing directly from Hannibal's playbook, as he had done to win over the Republic's southern Italian allies after Cannae. And to prove the sincerity of his claim, Anthony Everett notes, the Roman commander released nearly all the hostages whom the Carthaginians had interned. Intelligent clemency that won him high praise among the Iberian tribes. Interestingly, however, with some few, those originating from the tribes nearer to the Roman-controlled lands in the northeast, not yet released, Scipio retaining them under his own protection to be later handed back personally, knowing that such acts of generosity, at the right moment, might secure alliances and even military aid. To capture the image and reputation Scipio was cultivating, I think there's no better place to turn than a famous story from Livy, who recounts, among the captives was a maiden of such extraordinary beauty that wherever she went, she drew the eyes of everyone, betrothed to a prominent Celtiberian nobleman named Lucius. When Scipio learned of her engagement, he summoned Lucius to come to New Carthage. And when the young nobleman arrived expecting the worst, his bride paraded, her honor already stolen. Scipio rose with calm authority, saying, "Your betrothed has been in my camp with the same regard for her modesty as in the house of her own parents. She has been kept for you, unharmed and untouched. This is the only price that I ask in return for that gift. Be a friend to the Roman people, and if you believe me to be a good man, such as these tribes formerly came to know in my father and uncle, be assured that, like us, there could be no better friend to your people than the Roman Republic, and no worse enemy." With that, Scipio then released the maiden, not only unharmed, but with a generous wedding gift. Lucius, overwhelmed by such magnanimity, soon returned with 1,400 horsemen, pledging himself and his tribe's loyalty to Scipio. And although no other Iberian tribes immediately defected, still waiting to see how Carthage would respond, Scipio had planted the seeds. His conquest of Carthago Nova proved Rome's strength, just as his restraint and discipline proved his character. What's more, through this one brilliant victory, followed by subtle, calculated statesmanship, Scipio had already begun reshaping the political landscape of Hispania, setting tones that would echo through the rest of his campaign. Now, at this point, you might be wondering, wasn't Scipio still badly outnumbered? After all, there were still 3 major Carthaginian armies in Iberia, each just as large or larger than his own, and you'd be absolutely right. But here's the thing, none of those armies had the faintest idea of what had just happened. The lightning march and one-day conquest left them completely flat-footed. By the time news reached them, likely a week or 2 later, Carthago Nova was already firmly in Roman hands. The 3 Punic generals were in the exact same places they had been before Scipio's strike. Mago Barca held the far south at Gades, Hasdrubal Gisgo further west, and Hasdrubal Barca pursuing a siege against the Carpetani in central Spain. When word of the disaster finally arrived, they were stunned, but still they didn't move, for months in fact. Why not? Historians point to 3 main reasons. Firstly, fear of tribal uprisings. Howard Scullard explains, they feared to leave their present positions, with the Spanish tribes showing increased signs of unrest and defection when the news spread abroad. As you may recall, Iberia had already been a smoldering fire of unrest, ignited years earlier by Scipio's father and uncle. And while almost stamped out after the Battle of the Upper Baetis, Scipio had just thrown fresh fuel onto the embers to get the flames roaring again. Punic commanders couldn't risk abandoning their posts while local tribes wavered in loyalty, potentially leaving enemies at their backs. Second, retaking Carthago Nova was no simple matter. Scipio, before departing, would leave a strong Roman garrison, and beyond its formidable walls, the Romans controlled the sea. As Basil Hart points out, if they moved to regain Cartagena, itself impregnable if adequately garrisoned, even more so when the defender had the command of the sea. Meaning, any attempt at a Punic siege could be easily broken by Roman naval power. And then lastly, a fresh priority emerged, one that further delayed any action against the Romans. The Punic silver supply had to be resecured and rerouted. Scipio had captured the mint and disrupted their finances, but he had not yet seized the mines themselves. Protecting that lifeline was vital. However, this could only be fully addressed once the Iberian tribes were brought back under control. Even so, detachments were rushed to the key mining town of Castulo, from where bullion was now redirected much further in distance south to Gades, a route far more inefficient and fraught with dangers, such as bandits, than the one through Carthago Nova. And speaking of metals, Scipio's capture of Carthago Nova yielded another prize, less dramatic in the moment, but no less transformative, one of weaponry, or actually better yet, said as metallurgy. Metallurgical advances that remarkably few sources speak on, but would have been of great importance, as laid out in the Osprey book, Rome at War, when it says, after Scipio took Cartagena in 209 BC, a considerable number of Spanish swordsmiths were captured, who were then forced to teach Scipio's smiths their secrets. The result became a sword known as the Gladius Hispaniensis, a refashioned version of their existing swords, but greatly enhanced by advanced forging techniques. This weapon, the book goes on to say, contributed directly to Scipio's future victories, even before its widespread adoption across the Roman army a decade later. Before this, Roman swords were forged from wrought iron, serviceable, but prone to dulling and breaking, Iberian smiths, however, had mastered advanced methods, refining and layering their naturally carbon-rich iron into something that approached an early form of steel. The result? Blades that were tougher, sharper, less brittle, and far deadlier. Scipio grasped the importance of details like this immediately, while under his direction, Carthago Nova became a hub of military production. Polybius drives home the point, describing how Scipio visited the workshops daily, overseeing the craftsmen, paying particular attention to the weaponsmiths. And with everyone busily engaged upon the preparations of war, no one could have helped when they saw the town, labeling it as a workshop of war. Scipio understood he had won a city, yes, but 3 Carthaginian armies still roamed Spain. A full-on battle was inevitable, and when it came, Rome would need every sharpened edge it could gain. And yet, even as Scipio transformed Carthago Nova into Rome's newest stronghold, he was wise enough not to forget the broader picture. In the northeast, the Republic's holdings were still thinly held by 3,500 men under Marcus Junius Silanus. Scipio knew he couldn't linger too long in the south, risking a Punic counter. So after spending roughly 4 months overseeing matters in New Carthage, as Polybius tells us, repairing and strengthening its fortifications, installing a garrison of perhaps 4,000 men and a naval detachment, with the city secured, Scipio prepared to march back to Tarraco. By late summer, setting out with the rest of his force, about 23,000 strong, as Laelius once more shadowed the column by sea, and of note, taking the rest of the Iberian hostages with them as well. This time, however, Scipio wasn't racing. He was showcasing Rome's strength. Army and fleet advanced together up the coast, halting before each major settlement, including Saguntum, the very city whose fall had triggered the Second Punic War. And one by one, Livy writes, they all submitted. There were no battles, no drawn-out negotiations, just the awe of Carthago Nova's fall that carried ahead of Scipio like a thunderclap. Towns that had once defied Rome, or sat wavering between Punic and Roman allegiance, all rushed to open their gates. And amazingly, by the time Scipio reached Tarraco in the early autumn of 209 BC, just 1 year into his command, he had secured almost the entire eastern seaboard of Iberia, from Carthago Nova all the way north to Tarraco and Emporiae, now under Roman sway. This being the point not long after their return to Tarraco that Scipio dispatched Gaius Laelius to report to the Senate in Rome, also bringing the most valuable Carthaginian captives, around 20 nobles and members of its ruling elite. Of course, messages had already been sent ahead, but Scipio aimed to do more than just provide a full account of all that had happened. This was an opportunity to leverage his incredible successes to obtain more soldiers. Polybius gives us insight into Scipio's thinking. Since the Romans had for the most part regarded the situation in Spain as desperate, Scipio believed that the news would redouble the Senate's efforts to support him. As we well know by now, Scipio wasn't at all short on coin, although manpower was another story. His total forces stood at just over 30,000 men, but spread increasingly thin, needing to hold now both Carthago Nova and northeastern Hispania. This, while 90,000 Punic troops still controlled much of the peninsula. To seize the initiative and stay on offense, Scipio needed reinforcements, requesting at least 1 full legion and allied contingent, roughly 10,000 men. However, the Senate's response was, let's say, mixed. Whereas they publicly praised Scipio's incredible victory, Livy recording that the Senate decreed a thanksgiving for 1 day on account of Publius Scipio's successes. This formal day of thanksgiving, called a supplicatio, wherein all of Rome, senators, priests, and citizens alike made processions to the temples, prayed and gave thanks to the gods, in particular Jupiter and Mars. I would imagine, for obvious reasons, Neptune as well. Behind the praise, reinforcements were meager. Only 2,000 infantry and 200 cavalry would be sent, about 1/5 of what Scipio was hoping for, only slightly adding to his total count, when we factor in the estimated losses to his army up to that point in time. Why so little? Partly caution. Carthago Nova was a dazzling gain, no doubt, but Scipio had never commanded in a pitched battle. To some senators, this all might still unravel. And above all, Italy remained Rome's greatest concern, especially with Hannibal prowling the south. As Philip Freeman emphasizes, although he was vastly outnumbered and confined to southern Italy, he was still a military threat to Rome and an even greater psychological menace. The nightmare from which they could not awaken. As long as his army was roaming the countryside of Italy, the Romans could never feel safe. On top of this came disturbing new intelligence from the prisoners Scipio captured at Carthago Nova, learning that Hasdrubal Barca was planning to march his army to Italy. Though now delayed by the recent setback in Spain, the fear of a combined war of the Barca brothers against the Romans in Italy was enough to keep the most confident senators awake at night. So even as they praised Scipio publicly, senators hedged their bets. Not to mention, underpinning all of this was that much of the old guard, men like Fabius Maximus, still distrusted Scipio. His youth, his ambition, and the unconventional way he had risen to command, bypassing tradition and senatorial authority more than once. Livy makes clear Scipio would often have to wage war in Spain without the full confidence or the support of the Senate behind him. Like in this instance, with the Senate sending Laelius back to Scipio, conveying formal thanks, their orders to continue the war with the same spirit and vigor, and 2,200 reinforcements, but nothing more. Meaning that Scipio would have to press on in Hispania, essentially with the same number of men he had at the very start of his campaign. By the time Laelius returned to Tarraco near the close of 209 BC, we can imagine that Scipio must have been deeply frustrated with the Senate's meager response, having asked for an army's worth of reinforcements, but given only a fraction. Yet, true to form, he seems to have betrayed nothing publicly. Calm, composed, confident, acting as if it was all unfolding exactly as planned. If anyone glimpsed his real thoughts, it would have been his trusted lieutenant alone. However, what this also meant is that if Rome wouldn't provide what he needed, Scipio would have to conjure it himself. And here, his resourcefulness, charm, and eye for opportunity came once more to the foreground. Through the autumn and winter at Tarraco, he immersed himself in diplomacy. As Livy confirms, envoys came streaming in from nearly every Iberian tribe in northeastern Spain and along its frontiers. And here, Scipio played his hostages like master cards, returning them to their leading families, receiving the embassies with honor, while projecting unwavering Roman strength. His legend was spreading swiftly. The capture of Carthago Nova in a single day, Neptune himself tipping the battle in Rome's favor, Scipio's clemency toward captives, always poised with tribal chieftains, confident without arrogance, Scipio seemed touched by the gods, a man destined to prevail. Meanwhile, the Carthaginian commanders remained sluggish, their inaction feeding Scipio's narrative of Roman strength and Punic weakness. And little by little, it worked. Over the winter into the following spring of 208 BC, allies began to come over. Powerful eastern groups like the Edetani and Elargeti pledging support, adding 5,000 Iberian troops to Scipio's army, light and medium infantry, and swift cavalry. And when combined with the 2,200 reinforcements Rome had provided, while this certainly helped, the Roman general deemed it still not enough, so he turned to another bold measure. According to Polybius, this was when he decommissioned a portion of his naval fleet, selecting the strongest marines and oarsmen, converting them into ground troops, and sprinkling them in among his existing maniples. Through this, gaining around 4,000 more soldiers by beaching 13 to 15 of his ships at Tarraco. But even so, with the fleet stronger than it had been at the start of his campaign, more than sufficient to continue dominating the eastern coast of Hispania. However, with Scipio not yet finished with his preparations, having increased his army's count, but knowing that quality mattered just as much as quantity, through the winter, in line with one of his trademarks, Scipio trained and drilled his army relentlessly, molding it into something sharper still. And not by solely focusing his army on conditioning and discipline, as it had been over the previous winter. This time, Howard Scullard states, Scipio trained them in new methods, having realized the essential weak points of the Roman army of his day and how best they might be remedied, employing new tactical formations and drills, which, in time, would place Scipio among the world's greatest generals. Diplomacy, recruitment, resourcefulness, and above all, meticulous preparation. By the spring of 208 BC, through all these actions, Scipio had amazingly reforged his army into something new once again, tempered and stronger, something Roman yet distinctly his own. And he would soon need every ounce of that strength, for at last, a Carthaginian response was finally in the making. Before the end of 209 BC, with Hasdrubal Barca, after settling matters with the Carpetani, leading his 33,000-strong army south to the town of Castulo, some 330 kilometers west of Carthago Nova, where he intended to reverse the staggering blow Rome had struck, given what Basil Hart highlights, the grim reality of the shifting scales in Hispania. Hasdrubal felt forced to take the offensive. His motives were layered, and related to something we talked about earlier. Castulo guarded the approaches to Spain's silver mines, the lifeblood of Carthage's war effort. Hasdrubal's presence secured those supply lines, furthermore, positioning him closer to his brother Mago near Gadez, while Hasdrubal Gisgo remained further afield with his forces, policing the restive tribes of western and central Iberia. But more importantly, Castulo brought Hasdrubal nearer to Carthago Nova and nearer to the Romans, though he knew the city was too strong to take. From Polybius we learn, Hasdrubal sought to instead draw Scipio inland, away from the coast, into the same killing grounds where just 2 years before he had annihilated Scipio's father and uncle. With him rode the Numidian prince Massinissa, commanding 3,000 to 4,000 of the finest light horsemen in the western Mediterranean. And from Castulo, Carthaginian skirmishers and Numidian cavalry began carrying out vicious raids to the east, specifically harassing Scipio's Iberian allies, burning villages, striking convoys, testing loyalties, and trying to drive wedges between Tarraco and Carthago Nova, all of which amounted to a taunting dare flung in Scipio's face, and one that he knew Scipio couldn't ignore. If Rome's growing foothold in Hispania was to mean anything, if his new Iberian allies were to believe in his protection, the Roman general had to march. But Scipio was no puppet dancing to Hasdrubal's strings. He saw the trap for what it was, and strode toward it willingly, calculating that if he could beat the Carthaginians on open ground, in the kind of fight they believed themselves dominant, it would shake Iberia to its core, driving more tribes to the Roman banner, the next key step in dismantling Carthage's Hispanian empire piece by piece. And so, in early March 208 BC, Scipio broke winter quarters. With Gaius Laelius Silanus, his younger brother Lucius, and 35,000 men, 30,000 Roman and Italian allies, and the 5,000 Iberians gathered over the winter. Over the next weeks, they marched from Tarraco south to Saguntum, before pivoting inland, heading southwest toward Castulo. He knew the risks. He knew what had happened to his father and uncle on those same very grounds. But Scipio was ready. He wanted this fight. The dare accepted in full, intending to meet Hasdrubal Barca head on. In the next episode, we'll pick up things from here, with Scipio on the eve of his first set-piece battle. And though much doubt still surrounded the 28-year-old Roman commander, in the spring of 208 BC, at the Battle of Baecula, despite facing Hasdrubal Barca's army in a near impregnable position, Scipio would soundly silence his critics, with audacity, deception, and tactical brilliance, rivaling even that of Hannibal, in a resounding victory that would strengthen the Republic's widening grip on Hispania, while also, interestingly, stirring up controversy in Rome. The Senate criticizing his choices, allowing Hasdrubal to slip away with the remnants of his army, bound for Italy, while rumors swirled about with the Iberians hailing Scipio as a king. A good point for us to briefly pivot back to the unfolding war in Italy, catching us up to the current time frame, with Hannibal still entrenched in the south, devastating Roman armies even as his brother Hasdrubal crossed the Alps to invade from the north, setting the stage for the Battle of the Metaurus in 207 BC. At the same time that, back in Spain, Scipio would be tested as never before, locked into a grinding war of attrition, hounded by Carthaginian forces and Massinisa's lightning-fast Numidian cavalry. A brutal campaign of raids and counter-raids as the remaining Punic commanders gathered their strength for one last, massive showdown over the fate of Iberia. This and more to come in the next episode of the Warlords of History podcast. And in the meanwhile, if you want to support the podcast, there are many ways you can help. You can tell your family and friends about the show. Please rate, review, and subscribe on whichever platform you happen to access the show on. You can follow the podcast on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. And lastly, you can head on over to the show's website, warlordsofhistory.com, where, on the support section of the site, you can find the show's Patreon or PayPal links in the event that you want to contribute to the podcast directly. But beyond this, where I'll also include some additional info, like images and maps pertaining to this episode for your viewing pleasure, and where you can also reach out to me with any thoughts, questions, or suggestions. I would love to hear from you. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the episode. Theme music from audionautics.com.